All right, I'm going to get started because we have a full program tonight and we're so excited to be here. Good evening, my name is Madeline Rosenberg and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist at the Princeton Public Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Black Activism Then and Now. In honor of Black History Month, this virtual discussion will explore the theme of Black activism in historical and contemporary perspective. The program features Meena Jagannath, Reverend Lukata Mjumbe, and Shana L. Redmond. Unfortunately, Derecka Purnell is unable to join us as a moderator tonight, but we are thrilled to have minister, activist, and scholar Niall Fort, who co-planned this program with Derecka and the library, serve as moderator in her place. An audience Q&A will follow the conversation. I want to thank Derecka and Niall for their collaboration in designing this event. Thanks to the Pace Center for Civic Engagement at Princeton University and the Paul Robeson House of Princeton for their partnership on this program. This program is made possible with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. A few quick housekeeping items before we begin. First, I recommend using the Zoom app rather than the web-based version of Zoom if you're able. This event is being recorded. Recordings are typically added to the library's YouTube channel a few weeks after the event. Live transcription is enabled for this program, so you can turn it on or off using the buttons at the bottom of your screen. If you have comments during the program, please enter them in the chat box. If you have a question you're hoping the speakers can get to later on, please enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a mobile device, that Q&A function may be at the top right corner of your screen. And finally, it's now my honor to introduce tonight's moderator, Niall Fort. Niall is a minister, activist, and scholar. His work addresses issues of social justice through cutting-edge scholarship, community-based organizing, and large-scale social movements. Niall earned his BA in English from Morehouse College and his PhD in Religion and Interdisciplinary Humanities with a concentration in African American Studies from Princeton University. He currently teaches at Columbia University. So please join me in virtually welcoming Niall, and I'll now turn it over to him.
Thank you so much, Madeline, and thank you to the Princeton Public Library for organizing such a wonderful event. Thank you all for joining on a weekday. I hope that you all ate good food because you're about to get a little bit more from the panel today. We have such just remarkable people who are going to offer some thoughts during Black History Month. I'm actually going to get right out the way just to be able to ask some questions, but really the conversation today is in part about the past and the legacy of Paul Robeson. The legacy of Paul Robeson, both on a local level in Princeton, on a national level across the country, but also an international level across the world. But of course, when we look to the past, we do so in order to think more deeply about the present and to be able to envision more creatively about the future. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to ask them a few questions. We're going to get into it. And then we're going to invite you all to ask some questions. So as we talk and we engage in a conversation, feel free to put some of your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get around to engaging you all as well. Meena Jagannath is Director of Global Programs at Movement Law Lab. Prior to coming to the lab, Jagannath co-directed the Community Justice Project Incorporated, a Miami-based movement lawyering organization supporting campaigns for racial justice and human rights. She is a movement lawyer with an extensive background in activism and international human rights, including work in Haiti and Guatemala. While in Miami, Jagannath used her legal skills to build the power of movements locally in South Florida around workers' rights, housing, gentrification, and police brutality. She has also brought to bear her international human rights expertise in delegations to the United Nations to elevate US-based human rights issues like police accountability in Ferguson and Miami, as well as stand your ground laws to the international level. Jagannath received her JD from the University of Washington School of Law, where she was a William H. Gates Public Service Law Scholar. She also holds a master's degree in international affairs, human rights, from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and a BA in International Relations and Peace and Justice Studies from Tufts University. Everybody, please welcome Meena Jagannath. Thank you for being here. Reverend Lukata Mjumbe is the pastor of the historic Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church of Princeton, New Jersey, Witherspoon Street's longest serving pastor was the Reverend William Drew Robeson and the father of Paul Robeson. Like father and son, Reverend M Junebe is a deeply committed advocate and organizer, talented theater artist, and respected scholar committing to the radical transformation and salvation of oppressed communities and marginalized people. He is a high honors political science graduate of Morehouse College. Shout out to Morehouse College, my brother, and Princeton Theological Seminary in Religion and Society, Masters of Divinity and Masters of Theology. He also serves as the Faith Policy Advisor to Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. Welcome, Pastor Mjumbe. Shana L. Redmond, PhD, is a scholar and continuing student of the Black radical tradition. She is the author of Anthem, Social Movements, and the Sound of Solidarity in the African Diaspora, and Everything Man, the Form and Function of Paul Robeson, which just came out in 2020, which among her other accolades, Redmond received a 2021 American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation. She is the president-elect of the American Studies Association and professor of English and Comparative Literature and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. Welcome, Professor Redmond. All right, let's get right into it, y'all. We don't have a lot of time and we want to get to the Q&A. So Professor Redmond, if I may, I want to start with you. Just tell us about Paul Robeson. You wrote the book. Let's say you were talking to a friend who's heard Paul Robeson's name, but really doesn't know much about him. Can you tell that friend a little bit about Paul Robeson and his significance today?
Well, if I had a friend who knew his name, I would count myself lucky. Unfortunately, there are too many people who don't know his name, and that was not for an act of forgetting on the part of global peoples. It was enforced. It was a coerced forgetting, right, at the hands of the State Department, both in the U.S. and in various other colonial nations around the world. So I would say, true to the title of my book, which started out kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the more I studied became ever the more true. He was everything. He was everything to everyone. And he was a man who was born in 1898, lived until 1976, and so he saw a lot of life, a lot of changes in the world, changes that in many ways he helped to facilitate, both as an artist. He was a theater and film actor. He was a musician, of course, which I pay a lot of attention to in my book, someone who pioneered the use of the Negro spirituals, and was a hugely significant artistic but also political influence on a global scale. He was someone who was responsible for helping to found the Council on African Affairs, which was a global diasporic organization, radical left organization, that made it its mission to actually inform African descended peoples all over the world, particularly in the United States, about their ancestry on the continent, and paid a lot of attention to worker struggles in South Africa and other colonial nations, colonized nations rather. He was someone who was one of the petitioners and organizers for the 1951 We Charge Genocide petition that went to the United Nations. He delivered the formal copy to the UN in New York City. And this was, of course, in the 1950s when his passport was revoked by the US State Department for essentially being an enemy of the state. They would not allow him to travel abroad from 1950 to 1958. So he lost most of his earnings, most of his popular career for the Red Scare, the second Red Scare in the 40s, late 40s and 50s, but argued, and this is one of my favorite lines from him, that there was no force on earth that was going to move him from his firm convictions, not even 1/1000th of an inch. And he was someone who lived those principles every single day of his life and encouraged others to do the same, but was also willing to be the person who took the blame and the public hits and the surveillance and everything else in order to protect the identities and integrity of his comrades. And he was a phenomenal, phenomenal person.
Wow, thank you so much for setting the stage for us. And when you talked about this force and commitment to not be moved from his principles, it makes me think about how that commitment moved him across the world. That very commitment that forced him to stand his ground moved him all around the world. And a lot of times when we talk about activism, we talk about it sort of across the country, especially during Black History Month. And we can sometimes overlook those very local struggles, the way that even a national figure like Paul Robeson has actually impacted, of course, international questions and nationally, but right here in Princeton. So I want to ask you, Reverend Mjumbe, how does Paul Robeson's legacy speak to the Princeton area and his relationship to the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church in particular?
I think in some ways you cannot understand Princeton. You certainly can't understand Black Princeton if you don't understand the legacy of the Robeson family. Paul Robeson was the son, one of the sons of the gentleman over my shoulder here, Reverend William Drew Robeson, who was the longest serving pastor of Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. We're celebrating our 181-year anniversary this year. And when we understand the Robeson family, William Drew Robeson, his mother, Louisa Bustillo Robeson, we understand how Black excellence and Black commitment emerged up out of this place alongside an affluent white racist community, in all honesty, but refused to be silent. Within the legacy of the Robeson family, you have resistance to the racism of Woodrow Wilson, who was then the president of Princeton University before he became president of the United States, as he demanded that one of Paul's older brothers be able to enroll at Princeton University. But the response was that we don't have coloreds here at Princeton University. Here you see when you had a man like William Drew Robeson who taught his children Greek and Latin at very early ages and emphasized not only academic excellence, but moral excellence, stood up against lynching during the McKinley administration, stood up against poverty, was someone who he himself had escaped from slavery, William Drew Robeson, but instilled and planted all of those seeds within his children and within Paul, only to suffer great and tremendous consequences, ultimately being pushed out of the church, having his call dissolved, and ended up right around the corner where his wife eventually succumbed to injuries from a fire that came from, she had lost her sight, a coal had fallen onto her clothes, she caught a fire and ultimately died, but kept pushing, but kept fighting, but refused to lose, and always emphasized taking the right side. And so when I think about Princeton, this local community, I see the inspiration to academic excellence, the inspiration to artistic excellence, the inspiration to see beyond the place where you came from and to take it all around the world. But in Paul Robeson, even before I became a pastor and was inspired by his father, Paul Robeson inspired me as an activist, as an organizer, as someone who thought locally, who worked locally but had visions that were global. And he continues every single day to be a role model, a standard. We can learn lessons, both good and bad. We can see how much he was ahead of his time, because the things that we have to fight today, the things that we have to face today, and the things that we have not yet fully had to confront today, we can see within the legacy of Paul Robeson as a child all the way up to when he became an international celebrity advocate and change maker.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that background. Sometimes, we see these leaders as if they came out of nowhere, as if they didn't have a family.
A mama and a daddy, brothers and sisters, and a community that birthed him, that took care of him, and that still loves him today.
Absolutely. That's so important to realize, even during Black History Month. Of course, we in the mainstream talk about Dr. King as if Dr. King just sort of sprung out of Morehouse College without a Benjamin Elijah Mays, or without, more importantly, a movement that made him possible. I would imagine that's the same thing when it comes to Paul Robeson and any
And Martin Luther
of
King
the
had a
Black,
mama and a daddy too.
had a mama and a dad, Daddy King,
That
right?
were important.
Very important.
And Mama King.
So a part of what you're saying is also reminding me, when I first got to Princeton for my doctoral degree, to start my doctoral degree, the undergrads were protesting on the heels of the Ferguson uprising. This is 2014. And one of the things that they were pushing for was a change of the School of Public Policy, which was named the Woodrow Wilson School. And so the history that you're talking about speaks directly not only to what was happening nationally in Ferguson and across the country, but what was happening right at Princeton University. And I think it's important what you said about Paul Robeson and that relationship between President Woodrow Wilson, because while the students were fighting against the naming of the school being under Woodrow Wilson, we're not always seeing ourselves in the tradition of a Paul Robeson who had already been, right, fighting and resisting these broader structures that go back to the very beginning of Princeton's history. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table today. Meena, can you talk about the work you do as a lawyer? So we know that the Everything Man was also trained as a lawyer, and we read in your bio all the work that you're doing as a lawyer. What's the role of lawyers from your own personal experience? Why is it important also to build these internationalist connections in our fight for justice in light of the work you've done in the United Nations?
Thank you, Niall. And you gave me a little bit of license to maneuver here with the questions, so I may do that just to piggyback off of what Dr. Redmond and Reverend M Junebe said, because I've actually been revisiting Robeson, and I'm actually from Down Ridge Road, from the next town over. I grew up in South Brunswick, so it's an honor to be here for that reason as well. It's interesting reading Robeson's work, especially in the book Here I Stand, because what I found in my work, my background is in international human rights, but I came to practice for about a decade in Miami with local movements like Dream Defenders, Miami Worker Center, and others. It was really interesting to me that there was it was hard for me to find a resonance between the work that I had done internationally and the work being done locally, because that, as Dr. Redmond was saying, that sort of connection between local fights in the US and the sort of international analogs that had been ruptured somewhere, and a lot of that is purposeful, as Dr. Redmond was saying, and really when I read what Robeson has written, and also W.B. Du Bois and others of that era, it's so clear that at that time there was such a like a clear through line between what was going on in the US and what was going on internationally. So in a lot of ways I would say, like, my journey has, being a daughter of immigrants, primarily like locating myself in the international space through my work. It has been interesting coming back to the US and really trying to bridge, the what have emerged as almost like, sort of separate discourses. There's like the discourse of social justice in the US, which has primarily taken, sort of the civil rights route. And then there's the discourse internationally, which has, taken this human rights route. And, as even Malcolm X has said, we need to think about it as a human rights and beyond. And so anyway, to get to your actual question, the work that I do as a lawyer, I have for a long time practiced in, with an approach called movement lawyering. Movement lawyering is kind of emerges out of a tradition of, people's lawyers, radical lawyers, lawyers for the people, community lawyers, folks who understand that social movements have always been the engine of social change, that organizing has always been at the root of social change. And so our role as lawyers is to work to build the power of those movements and build and to to lend our skills as lawyers and the tactics that we can use to support campaigns for social justice. And I could stop there unless it sounded like you had you had another question.
No, please, we got time. Take your time, as we say in the Black church. Take your time.
Well, the last thing that I was just going to say was, I practiced for a decade in Miami, and after a long time of really feeling like we were in a lot of reactive kinds of campaigns, campaigns against the police, gentrification campaigns, workers' rights campaigns, I have now sort of moved back to the global space to really try to sort of understand the global forces that are producing, the manifestations of injustice that we see at the local level. They're all interconnected, right? Like the systems that are producing injustice, in Princeton and Miami and the other places are the same systems that are oppressing people elsewhere. So the question is, how might we actually do our work from an analytical standpoint where we understand how the interconnections between these things and are able to address them also at the global level and not just, atomize the fights in our respective local contexts.
Yeah, no, that's really, really important. And what you all are, at least for me, as I'm listening to you, I'm like, okay, so we know the sort of mainstream narrative of Black History Month or of the African-American sojourn. And three things, there's a lot of things, but one is this kind of idea of a singular charismatic leader that stands alone. Another is what you mentioned in terms of this kind of narrative of civil rights, that the primary point of concern was this championing of civil rights. And the other thing is this kind of confining to the domestic sphere, not thinking more broadly beyond the borders of the United States. And all your comments together are making me think how Paul Robeson in many ways is an opportunity to tell a different type of story about Black people more generally, about Black history more generally, and about Black struggle more generally. And so I'm really appreciative of the way that you all are sort of through-lining a broader story about not just Paul Robeson, but about this kind of broader experience of struggle that we're all in. And also I wanna say for those who are listening in, we again appreciate you for being here. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. I think I see somebody, maybe not, but go ahead and start putting your questions in the Q&A so that by the time we get to about 7:45, we can engage you directly. But before we do that, let's have a couple more questions. Professor Redmond, can you discuss what you mentioned when you were telling your friend or our imaginary friend about who Everything Man Paul Robeson was? Can you discuss We Charge Genocide a little bit more and Paul Robeson's role in it, or his involvement more broadly in the liberation movement of his time?
Yeah, so the 1951 document, We Charge Genocide, was developed along with William Patterson in particular. William Patterson, who was a movement activist in the Northeast and had been a mentor and friend to Paul Robeson for some significant amount of time. And they, in concert with a number of different organizations, developed this language of We Charge Genocide. And it became this long document with hundreds, thousands of signatories to it, in which they laid out the human rights abuses that had happened to African descended peoples around the world, but with some attention and focus to the United States, because the point was to actually argue the United States as a practitioner of domestic genocide, right? That they were actively laying siege against African descended peoples in the United States. And so they're taking on the language of the Geneva Convention, of these various kind of lobbying bodies that had been ratified by the UN, and using it to petition that global body so that they might bring charges against the United States. And we saw the same language used 2 centuries later by activists coming out of Chicago, right? That there was another We Charge Genocide that developed in not too distant a memory. So this language was really, really powerful, right? And a lot of the language that they gave to evidence this genocidal practice was around police and policing of Black communities, right? It was both about the ongoing presence of lynching, which we often assume to be kind of vigilante violence, but they were not so subtly arguing that this was a structural violence that was also enacted by the police. And so the long history of lynching as violations against Black communities, as well as the juridically kind of enforced elements of policing and surveillance, were both being taken up as kind of primary evidence of the genocidal practices of the US state. And Robeson organized to get signatories, certainly other more prominent people, although he seems to have been one of the most resonant names involved in the campaign just for his celebrity, right? In the 1930s and 40s, at various moments, he was the most famous Black person in the entire world. So to have had him participate in this campaign was really momentous. And as I mentioned, he hand delivered it to the UN office in New York City in 1951. And actually there's a printed copy from 51 or around that period, a bound kind of book copy of We Charge Genocide. And there's a single hand on the cover of that book, and it's Paul Robeson's hand that kind of graces that cover. So he was everywhere present in the document, having learned, as Reverend Mjumbe said, from his father, who was the most important influence in his life, having learned at the feet of W.E.B. Du Bois, whom he called professor, right? All of these people, the Communist Party organizers, the socialist thinkers, many, many academics, others of his mentors who were coming up after him, who he also equally learned from, people like Ossie Davis and Harry Belafonte, these people who developed community around him, as well as his own partner, Eslanda Good Robeson, who was an activist and intellectual and radical theorist in her own right. And so much of what he was learning, and also, of course, being influenced very, very deeply by the African decolonial activists whom he met during the decade almost that he lived in England, the 1930s. He spent most of his days in England and traveling Western Europe, and so was in conversation with Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, these people who were independence, anti-colonial activists, and traveled to the metropole of London to earn their degrees. He was meeting with them. They were seeking him out in order to commune and develop ideas and strategies for moving into decolonization on the continent. And so he was a formative intellectual in his own right, formative organizer, and someone who used the arts as the passage for both.
Thank you so much. I want to come back around to the arts, but before we do that, you mentioned the second, the delegation in the wake of the Ferguson uprising that also sort of stood in the tradition of We Charge Genocide. And Meena, I know that you were one of the members of that delegation. So can you talk to us about what made you go on that delegation? Can you talk to us about what that experience was like, particularly at the beginning, the beginning rumblings of what eventually became known as the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter? Tell us a little bit about what that was, what that meant for you, and what that means for us today.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for talking about the petition. In fact, I was actually on a parallel delegation. So I was with the parents of Michael Brown and activists from Ferguson that happened to be in the same delegation with the folks from Chicago. But it was kind of like we had like sort of a parallel advocacy tracks, and what the story from Ferguson was that basically in August, as we all know, of 2014, Michael Brown was killed, and at that time, there were a lot of folks talking about what can be done to advance, to not just bring accountability, but also to put the case on a world stage. And it was at that moment that the family, as well as activists, had decided that they wanted to bring the case before the Committee Against Torture. And during that same time, young people from Chicago had come on the Charge Genocide delegation, and they were specifically talking about the deaths of some of their friends at the hands of the Chicago police, and so also like the legacy of the Burge torture cases and such. And it was, it was momentous also because on that same delegation, we had someone who was imprisoned in Guantanamo for a decade, who was coming to testify about his experience there. And it really was a moment where we were saying, the US, it touts its reputation on the world stage as some bastion of human rights, and meanwhile, it is killing its own people, running tanks through the streets, and holding people arbitrarily offshore, and among many other abuses of its own people. And so part of that tactic was really to try to use the UN as a stage to build solidarity globally, to, as I think Robeson and many others had done in their speaking engagements while abroad, to really say, okay, like, we want to speak directly to the people of the world, and we want to tell you what's actually happening. The US government will have you think differently. The media will have you think differently. The shows and other cultural work will have you think differently. But we're here to tell you what's actually going on. And I think part of what it was for the family and for the activists is that what justice they weren't able to receive at home, or what ears they could not reach while at home in Ferguson, they would try to reach them abroad.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, part of the power of this panel is not only that you all have thought deeply, not just about Paul Robeson, but about this larger tradition that he stands in, but also because you've worked in it. You've been freedom fighters in the most expansive sense, those who are thinking deeply about these questions, but also those who have contributed and sacrificed time and sweat and efforts into what it means to carry on that legacy. And with that, I mean, Reverend M Junebe, Brother Lukata, who also went to the illustrious Morehouse College. I just have to say that because, we don't always get a chance to say that in places like Princeton. Went to the illustrious Morehouse College at a different time than I did. I'm curious about, in terms of your work in ministry, how does the spirit of Paul Robeson, I mean, I've seen you preach before. I've organized with you around some things. I just want to give some space for you to talk about, what does this look like as a pastor? What does this look like as a minister? Talk about that tradition a little bit.
Well, there are many Christians, at least, I don't know if they wear them anymore, but back in the day, they used to wear these "What would Jesus do" kind of bracelets. I never wore one of those. But when you ask the question, what would Jesus do? It's because Jesus gives you a model of how you're supposed to live. And I've always been convinced that the best way of teaching people about Jesus Christ as a Christian minister is to try to live like he lived, and love like he loved, and teach the way that he taught, and sacrifice the way that he sacrificed. And in the same way, when I think about Paul Robeson, or even William Drew Robeson, as a pastor, as an activist, as an organizer, I frequently ask the question, what would Paul do? What would William Drew do? Just like I had asked for years, what would Malcolm do? Because I see a line, revolutionary psychiatrist Frantz Fanon said that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its own mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And we can see Robeson and the work against the systematic destruction of a group of people, genocide in whole or in part. going back to the early 1950s and beyond. But then we can also see how the same language that he was using when he declared that he was an Afro-American, and his commitment to be an African and to learn what it meant to be an African and to learn African languages, that then showed up when you find Malcolm X, who calls himself eventually an Afro-American, and also charges genocide and talks about human rights and the difference between civil rights and human rights and the importance of connecting the struggle of Black people in the United States and in the Americas and forming the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And then we see that continuing after Malcolm with the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Movement. And so in my view, the way that we teach, the way that we preach, the way that we continue the legacy is by living it. So as a pastor, as a minister, the passage that inspires me is Isaiah 61 and Luke 4, that says that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, release to the captive, sight to the blind, liberation for all who are oppressed. And so for me, it's very easy to integrate Paul and Jesus and William Drew and Malcolm together as a signpost and a guidepost for Christian ministry. And it must show up in our preaching and our teaching and our advocacy and our pastoral care. I can't imagine Paul Robeson as a singer and as an actor and as an artist separated and divorced from his identity and his commitment as an advocate, as an activist, as a freedom fighter, as a revolutionary. And I don't want to imagine myself, and unfortunately there are many models of pastors and preachers that you can see a disconnection, but I don't want to be one that can ever imagine myself, and I don't want others to be able to imagine my ministry as a pastor and a preacher and as a Christian, someone who seeks to be Christ-like, like Christ, separated from my identity as an activist, as an organizer, as an advocate. Jesus Christ was a Black revolutionary. So in order to be a Christian, in my view, to be Christ-like means to be like a Black revolutionary. And so blending them, integrating them together, it helps me to oftentimes pause. Because I know that there are consequences. I mean, it was said earlier by Dr. Redmond, Paul Robeson paid a very heavy price, as did so many before him and after him, for standing up and speaking out. I am in the building next door to the home where Paul Robeson was born, where he grew up the early part of his life. But I know that his father suffered serious consequences when he spoke up against white supremacy, when he spoke up against the way that Black people who had come out of slavery were continuing to be treated supposedly in the free North. So we can learn from Paul Robeson, we can celebrate, we can look back, but we have to know that there has been a continuation of struggle against genocide, for peace, for freedom, for justice, for human rights. And at every step, there have been consequences. At every step, that when you have found women and men who stood up as freedom fighters, that there have been a heavy weight. And you know, many people want to just talk about Paul Robeson, the deep baritone, Old Man River, and that's so important as a part of what he was. But would you have really loved Paul Robeson when he was alive, when he was being burned in effigy up in upstate New York, when he was having his passport seized, when he was thinking that he had been poisoned, when he was given electroshock treatment, when he was being attacked and vilified before the House Un-American Activities Committee? And so when we look back, you know, and Malcolm X said it well, and we'll be remembering his death, his assassination a week from on Monday, February the 21st. He was asked once, well, which politicians do you actually respect? And he said, well, you know, my standard tends to be, I look to see who is being attacked the most. And that's who I assume is doing the most on behalf of Black people. And he pointed to people like Reverend Adam Clayton Powell as a model and an example. So it gives me reason for inspiration as a Christian minister, as a pastor, but it also gives me reason to be humble, wise, careful, strategic, and connected. I think we see in Paul Robeson someone who, as much as people came to support him and celebrate him in the earlier part of his life, that when the fires of oppression came down upon him, he felt alone in some places. And Dr. King said, and we may not always remember all the words of our enemies, but we never forget the silence of our friends. And so there's some lessons to be learned from Paul Robeson, from William Drew Robeson, and all of those who came before them. And for us today, let us not think because this is fashionable and in style in some ways in 2022, or because we were all able to march for months in 2020 around George Floyd, that there are not deep and heavy consequences. And some of us in this generation and this next generation have already begun to suffer some of those consequences. And we should know that history will show us that there is more yet to come.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, those rich comments, you know, as you were talking, there's so much to get into. As you were talking, it reminded me of when you told me, like the second or third time I met you, you said, I'm a Nat Turner Christian.
Amen.
And those qualifications that you would give to the type of way you minister and show up in the world, I think is really inspiring. Also reminds me of what it means to be a student of. Professor Redmond, you talked about being not just a scholar of, but a student of the Black radical tradition. And so there's just so many ways that the spirit of Paul Robeson and the struggle that birthed him and sustained him has touched the church, and folks like you have touched the academy and those who are really resisting its logics, has touched the courtroom and those who are struggling in that tradition of internationalism, so on and so forth. So we don't have a lot of time left, and I encourage one last time for those who have stayed on with us too, we appreciate that, to put some of your questions in the Q&A box. I'm gonna ask one more question and then we're gonna engage you all. I wanna talk about what y'all are up to now. So we talked a little bit about the history of Paul Robeson and what that has meant in terms of how we think about Black history more generally. We've talked about some of the activism now, talked about Ferguson. 2020 was mentioned in terms of the massive protests that took place across the country and the world. But I want to give you all a little bit of time to share about what you have going on now. Professor Redmond, I know that you are currently a part of a coalition to remove cops from college campuses. So I was hoping you could discuss this kind of contemporary racial justice moment around abolition and your particular relationship to it in terms of that coalition.
Yeah, so my participation in the Cops Off Campus Coalition was something that developed during my time on faculty at UCLA, and it's something that kind of grew at a really localized campus level, but spread very surely and quickly through those campuses, as well as developing in connection with multiple national efforts. But certainly I would personally for sure see it as related to something like Fees Must Fall in South Africa, right? Which is really investing and demanding that these universities be held accountable, both for their incredible absences and violences, but also for their resources, right? They have to be responsible for the way they accumulate their money, for example. And this is something that is hitting a little bit harder now coming out to Columbia, right? There are different things to be managed and discussed, debated here, although some of these issues remain the same. So the Cops Off Campus Coalition is something that is variously based in many of the kinds of stories that we've heard at the national level now, when those stories are able to surface to that level. Surveillance, random stops, profiling, all of those things that are constantly happening, but also trying to think about the ways in which students and staff and faculty in some cases are, made to encounter policing as a means of mental health, right? That the police have been called in situations when mental health professionals should have been called, that there are many, many students that are displaced and houseless, right, who have been victim now to policing infrastructures due to their economic precarity. So trying to lay bare all of those things to work in concert, especially in LA with many of the movement organizations who are working around displacement and houselessness, but also trying to figure out some means and procedures forward. How do we actually abolish policing on campuses? And that is fundamentally our goal as a means of working in concert with the national and international pushes for abolition, is to get them off campuses. These are places of education. These are places that should be welcoming and accommodating to everyone. And the police, we know, do not make us safer. They make us more vulnerable. And so to actually remove them at that local level, to open the gates to communities, to other visitors and people who could be colleagues and comrades, is urgent. It's urgent for the ways in which we live. It's urgent for the ways in which we learn, and something that I think can be a model for other efforts toward abolition. So that is something that has been really, really significant in thinking about how power works at the university and trying to wrestle that power away from this centralized elite few who actually are out of touch with the kinds of concerns and experiences of their faculty, staff, and students, and to actually put that power back in the hands of the people who are most vulnerable. So those efforts that have blossomed into this incredible network across the country and the world has been really significant, certainly for my work in thinking about this radical tradition, because with We Charge Genocide and well before that, policing has been an issue for African descended peoples for a long, long time. This is not a new issue. This is not a new concern, and the struggle against it is not new either. So this is a continuation that I feel really strongly about.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I know that it's efforts that's happening in many college campuses. So I really encourage folks who are on this call, who are either on campuses for whatever reason, or you have children who are on college campuses, or you live near a college campus, to really think about joining those types of campaigns, because they're so important and they're very much intimately related to all the things we talked about. Oh man, I want y'all to all do your thing before we go to some of these questions. So really quickly, Meena, you've done so many things: the Community Justice Project, co-directing, the founding of the Law for Black Lives. Can you talk a little bit about what you're up to now? You know, something that you might want folks on here to know, maybe something that they can participate in.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So I am now at Movement Law Lab, and part of what I'm doing there is building a global network of movement lawyers. So really trying to identify and link together with lawyers that are supporting movements all across the world, from Colombia to Brazil to South Africa to Uganda to India to Philippines, and really try to one, I think, as I was saying earlier, like understand and think together about the different structural forces that are keeping us down, to think together about this question of decolonization. What does true decolonization require? Which I think is a frame that also applies to the US. And to really try to, you know, come up with a more robust international system that allows us to actually transnationally, you know, air our grievances and make complaints. You know, unfortunately, the We Charge Genocide, the complaint was not accepted because the UN was not designed to accept such a complaint, and that is a gap that we continue to see in the international legal system. And you know, the mechanisms that were built to actually respond to human rights abuses and concerns they don't actually give us teeth, you know, to really produce justice for people. And so part of, I think, what it is that we're trying to do, which is a long-term project, is to is to really try to shape those institutions, shape these international legal frameworks to really help support the kinds of transnational solidarity that we're trying to build between movements.
Thank you so much. And just for the sake of time, Pastor Mjumbe, if you can talk very briefly about the work that you're doing. I know you're doing so much, but I saw you put in the chat. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
And I'll be real brief. I mean, the main thing I'm doing is preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and seeking to live it out every single day. But when I cited Luke 4, he said, "Release to the captives," and I have been working for more than half of my life for the freedom of a freedom fighter from the civil rights and liberation movement, Sundiata Acoli. He is 85 years old, has been in prison since 1973, almost 50 years. And we have been actively working to bring him home. He is an important leader in our history. And today he's an 85-year-old man who they are trying to bring about an unofficial death penalty as a result of his sentence. You can't say that you loved Malcolm. You can't say that you loved Paul Robeson. You can't say that you loved the freedom fighters of the past when we have freedom fighters today who have been in prison almost 50 years. And Sundiata Acoli, I would just encourage people, go to hashtag Bring Sundiata Home. There's a lot of information. I was on a freedom fast for 67 days, completely from food, working. I'm been transitioning off now for the last couple of weeks. There are people all around the country, all around the world. We have over 20,000 signatures calling for the governor of New Jersey to grant him clemency, compassionate release. We had oral arguments a week ago, 2 weeks ago, before the New Jersey Supreme Court. He has already served double the amount of time that he should have served if he was absolutely guilty of everything he's been convicted of. The reason why he is still in prison is because of vengeance, is because of this desire to continue to make a political argument. Sundiata Acoli was the driver of the car that Joanne Chesimard, Sada Shakur was in back in 1973 that resulted in a terrible, tragic shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike, which left Zaid Shakur murdered, that left New Jersey State Trooper Officer Warner Forrester murdered, that left another New Jersey State Trooper, James Harper, injured, and left Assata Shakur shot in the back and shot in the back of the hand. And Sundiata was also shot and lost consciousness. He has been in prison since 1973, was eligible for parole in the spring of 1992. And he has had almost 30 years without a disciplinary infraction. So go to I put in the chat, Sundiata Acoli FC. .org is the website, but if you put in hashtag Bring Sundiata Home, SUNDIATA, you can get more information. You can sign the petition, you can send a postcard, you can raise your voice, because we must release the captives. We must bring them home. It is an act of genocide when we look at the prison population that we have in this country. That is one of the expressions of genocide in this country, and has been so since the early 1970s. Sundiata was in high school when Paul Robeson took the petition before the United Nations charging genocide. And here he is at 85 years old, having been COVID-19 positive, early stages of dementia, a number of health ailments, and we have to bring him home.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, very important to always not just remember, but continue to fight for political prisoners, and to know that there are political prisoners in this place called the United States. I was politicized by Mumia Abu-Jamal, and I wouldn't be here if it were not for his brilliance, for the fact that he's not just a symbol of someone that we can champion for, but someone who's actually given us so much to think about, to envision, so on and so forth. So thank you so much for saying that. There's a few questions here, and really a lot of them speak to perhaps one of the most important questions that we can leave with, which is always the most important, which is what do we do? You know, so we talk good, y'all talk real good And you have so much experience that you shared with so many of us from different places, from the church, from academia, from law. And people want to know, several people here, what do we do? And if you all can just shed light a little bit on that question, however you want to take it. For the folks, 50 participants on here, after they leave here today, what's something that they should be thinking about as we leave this kind of conversation? And maybe we can start with Professor Redmond.
I think just briefly, something that my mentor, Robin D.G. Kelly, talks of regularly is love, study, struggle, right? That those are the three kind of adages that guide his scholarship and his activism. And so I think it's really important to hold all of those things together all of the time. Even when one or the other may take precedence, we have to keep all of those in mind at the same time. So I think there are a whole host of lists, the syllabi that came out in response to many of the violences around the country, many of the protests around the country as well, that there are many opportunities for study, but to struggle, right? I think it's important, as Pastor Mjumbe said about Paul Robeson, right, to think globally, but to act locally, right? As cliche as that language has become, I think we have to be responsible for the places in which we live while always keeping in mind this global context, and to be learned in that situating and in those efforts. So the study is super, super important, as well as keeping in mind the love for the people around us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Starting with that love is so important as well. Meena, can you tell us a little bit of something of what we should leave with?
Well, that really resonates with me, love, study, and struggle. And I think the thing that I would add to that perhaps is really trying to embody the spirit of solidarity. I truly believe that we don't need to have gone through the things that people are experiencing to fight for them. I don't need to have, been through the same thing for me to join you in struggle. And I think we really, I think it's a quest for understanding. It's a quest for, really trying to join together in service of a vision where we can all live dignified lives and enjoy also the beauty of our planet. So that's what I'll leave you all with.
Thank you so much. And the beauty of our planet, so important to remember that that's also what we're fighting for. So thank you for that. Reverend M Junebe, can you give us a last word before we end it?
Dr. King said we must use time creatively with the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Walk outside, open your eyes, listen to people, connect with people, love people as an action verb. Love isn't a feeling or a secondhand emotion. Love is commitment. Love is action. And join an organization. If you can't find an organization, form one. This is the call right now. Each generation has to do it right now. And there are multiple opportunities. And let me say this, don't think you have to get it perfect to start. You will become more perfect and more complete, and you will learn this struggle as you do it, as you fail, as you succeed, as you struggle. And don't expect it to happen overnight. And so I would say join whatever you can. Join a church, join a fraternity, join a nonprofit, an NGO. Get involved with an organization, because we have to be organized. Our enemy is very well organized. And if we don't get organized as a community of advocates and activists, where it's very popular oftentimes to be the independent free agent that waxes eloquently and has no accountability, but the people will hold you accountable in ways that you will never hold yourself accountable. And so I would just encourage people to walk outside. You can put on your mask, but walk outside. And let's get to work, because we don't know how much time that we have left, and we are losing people every day that don't need to be lost. Because as George Jackson said, fascism is already here, and the time is now.
Thank you all so very much. Just want to say that these types of events are not just for us to celebrate figures like Paul Robeson, but to complete the legacy that they've left behind. So thank you all for offering so much of your time, so much of your brilliance, so much of your experiences. I learned a lot, and I could literally sit here for another hour. But like other folks, I'm a little hungry, so I'm gonna go eat after this. Thank you all. We want to thank Madeline Rosenberg and the Princeton Public Library for opening up this space. We also want to thank, of course, all of our panelists for just bringing so much richness for us today. And we don't want to forget Derecka Purnell, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it as our moderator, but truly is here in spirit. With that said, thank you all for coming. And Madeline Rosenberg, do you have something you want to say before?
Sure, just, more thank yous. Thank you to you, Niall, for being a terrific moderator and for helping to plan this program, and to our brilliant speakers, our engaged audience. We are recording this program and hope to make it more widely available. We hope that you'll take the time to fill out a survey if you're interested, because we're constantly trying to learn more about our audiences and what they would like to see in our programs. But most of all, thank you. Apologies for any technical difficulties that you may have noticed going on in the background, but we're all here. We made it, and I hope you have a wonderful night. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.